Hello, I am Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Second World War. In This Week in the Second World War, brought to you by the International Second World War History Network. In 1939, on the 24th of November, Japan captures Nanning. On the 29th of November, residents of occupied Poland are granted Soviet citizenship. And on the 30th of November, the Soviet Union invades Finland. In 1940, on the 24th of November, Slovakia signs the Tripartite Pact. On the 29th of November, a draft plan for the German invasion of the Soviet Union is issued. And on the 30th of November, the year-long Battle of South Guangxi ends in Chinese victory. In 1941, on the 25th of November, the Anti-Comintern Pact is renewed with Finland, Romania, Bulgaria, Denmark, Nanjing, China, Slovakia and Croatia. On the 26th of November, Neil Ritchie replaces Alan Cunningham as 8th Army Commander. On the 27th of November, US commanders are warned in negotiations with Japan had reached stalemate and that Japan might take hostile action. And on the 28th of November, Palestinian leader Amin al-Husseini meets Hitler. In 1942, on the 25th of November, Soviet forces launch Operation Mars around the Rzhevsk salient near Moscow. On the 27th of November, the French fleet in Toulon is scuttled. On the 28th of November, the Free French land on Reunion Island east of Madagascar, and on the 29th of November, British and American forces clash with the German army in Tunisia. In 1943, on the 25th of November, RAF Bomber Command Chief Arthur Harris declares Berlin would be bombed until the heart of Nazi Germany ceases to beat. On the 27th of November in Cairo, Roosevelt, Churchill and Chiang Kai-shek declare all occupied Chinese territory will be returned to China. On the 28th of November, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin meet in Tehran and agree Operation Overlord. On the 29th of November, the Anti-Fascist Council of National Liberation of Yugoslavia creates a shadow government, declares that the monarchy would not be restored, and asserts post-war Yugoslavia would be a federated state of 6 republics. And on the 30th of November, Guido Buffarini, Minister of the Interior for the Italian Social Republic, orders the arrest and deportation of Jews. In 1944, on the 24th of November, the Battle of Peleliu ends in Japanese victory, and Hungary's government flees Budapest. On the 26th of November, Himmler orders the destruction of the crematoria at Auschwitz. On the 27th of November, the Battle of Peleliu ends in American victory. On the 28th of November, Allies begin to operate Antwerp port. On the 29th of November, the Battle of Batina ends in victory for the Yugoslav and Red Armies, and the liberation of Albania is completed. In 1945, on the 29th of November, the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia is proclaimed. Well, there we are. This week in November, that's 39, 40, 41, 44, 2, 43, 44, 45, and a number of topics and events we're going to be discussing. So I'm going to bring in the co-host, your favorite Second World War historian, and that is Joe Quinn.
Surely not the favorite. I mean, that's way too generous.
Well, the word is interesting one, favorite. It can open to more than one interpretation.
Okay, yeah, of course. Yeah,
so yeah. I'm not saying you're the best.
Yeah. Okay. I should have trod very carefully on that one, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it is actually a compliment, but great to talk. Now, a quick one just on this week. Well, over the weekend, for those people who don't
aren't aware of it, the Second World War Museum in New Orleans hosts an annual conference in New Orleans, and they really do have a fantastic lineup. So I think it's 3 or 4 days of speakers, mainly Americans, but they had a few Brits there, including Claire Mully, talking about her recent work. Very interesting. You can see it all online. A lot to watch. So you have to be selective, and you also have to put it on 1.5 or 2.
Yeah. That's going to be on playback for me next week. I'm taking some time off work, so that I'm going to be watching all of that. I missed the live proceedings, but that's a great thing about YouTube, and the great thing about National World War II Museum is that they live stream everything, and basically it's all there on YouTube for you to watch. And some of the most interesting lectures about the Second World War, incidentally, have been ones that I've watched from the World War II conference. Yeah, it's brilliant.
One that I was really interested in, Nick Muller was interviewed, and he's the co-founder, basically co-director, and he was telling the story, which I think is well known, but it was great to have it, to be reminded that basically he and Stephen Ambrose, they were both working with the University of New Orleans. They were both in New Orleans. He was in administration. Stephen Ambrose was working on his archive. So he started interviewing the men who were to be the subject of Band of Brothers. And he decided he was doing the collecting the archive, and he wanted somewhere to store his archive of information. And he said, let's do a museum. And they went ahead and did it. But they really struggled between, I think it was in the mid-'80s, right through until basically the film Saving Private Ryan was released. And then suddenly it took off, and they got $300 million in the end to build the facility. So it's a campus, and it's got a museum, it's got artifacts, and approaching 1 million visitors. So there is more than one group of people I know in the world who are trying to create a Second World War museum. Anybody who's looking at that as a possibility, I suggest they have a look at that interview because it really is fascinating. Okay, let's get on with the subject. I'm going to just kick off with we've dealt with this, which is the Winter War. So in this week in 1939, the Soviets, having been negotiating rather unsatisfactorily with the Finns, invaded. And the map on the left shows you the 4 main thrusts across the border. So it was right across the border between the Soviet Union and Finland. And of course, as we know, the Soviets got into a bit of a mess, but eventually they forced a victory. And so eventually, on the 12th of March 1940, there was the Moscow Peace Treaty, which was fundamentally a major concession by the Finns. They ceded the Karelian Isthmus and most of the Ladoga Karelia, and the territorial losses in total exceeded what the Soviet pre-war demands were. But of course, that didn't finish the issue because the continuation war is what the Finns call it. The continuation war started on the 25th of June 1941 when the Finns joined in the Axis attack on the Soviet Union. And that war went on until the 19th of September 1944. So the Finns, again, suffering very badly, were forced to change their approach in 1944 and then set up, what lasted for, 8 decades, which was basically Finnish neutrality. Any quick observations on this Finnish war?
Yes, one of the biggest observations that I would make is it's to do with the concessions of territory that would happen at a later point. Now, obviously, the Winter War goes very badly for the Soviets. It's a real humiliation for them. It's it's one of the big tests, really, of how well the Soviet army can stand up. I mean, they've done relatively well in the East against the Japanese. They've given the Japanese a bloody nose, and Zhukov and his fighting formations, particularly his armored formations, have made mincemeat of the Japanese, and they're using tanks that are actually by that time are actually going out of date, and they're still actually winning a very decisive victory. So Soviet armor is proving itself to be not that bad when it comes to facing the Japanese on the steeps and plains over around the Siberian Mongolian frontier and in the Far East Far Eastern territories, which are being contested between the Japanese and the Soviets. The Japanese are really probing in this particular area and whatnot. And what the Soviets discover is that their armor isn't particularly good. In fact, it's absolute crap, and doesn't really get any better by the end of the war. And the Soviets conclude that they actually have the measure of the Japanese, and unless they upgrade, they're going to be an inferior enemy on the ground, which they will later exploit to great success when the Soviets invade Manchuria in 1945. But be that as it may, when it comes to Finland, they're probably a little bit overconfident. They massively underestimate the Finns, and they underestimate the terrain. I mean, you had that map up there, basically pointing out this particular front line, which it comes in and around, comes very close to, as they push further in, they come up against a prepared defensive line, which becomes known as the Mannerheim line, which is named after.
Yeah, that's on the right. That's the Mannerheim line.
Mannerheim line, yeah, it's on the right, and it's basically it's essentially, and then eventually they break through. But if you can just make it out, you'll see a lot of lakes and inlets and sort of riverways. That essentially this entire terrain is basically dotted with all these kind of low-lying marshlands and whatnot, and it's very easy for Soviet armor, because the Soviets depend very, very strongly on armor. It's very easy for their armor to get bogged down, and they lose tons of armor going into this particular part of Finland. It's very difficult terrain to contest, and this is very hard fought for. But to be fair to the Soviets, where the logic of what they've done comes into play is in terms of basically the value that these terrain concessions, which they've conquered, the value that they will later have after Operation Barbarossa when the Germans invade, because you had Ladoga, Karelia, that particular region there, and what that's referring to is basically it's referring to what would have been originally the Finnish side of Lake Ladoga, or the Finnish-controlled basically bank or shore of that lake. And what happens is basically once the Soviets have that terrain concession, they control what was originally the Finnish side of that lake. So they basically control all the land, the entire shoreline around Ladoga. It becomes entirely theirs, which is absolutely crucial from late 41 right through until basically late 43 for 2.5 years, particularly in 41, 42 and going into 43. Ladoga, when it freezes over, basically you can traverse the lake using motor vehicles, and they go across the frozen lake in the middle of winter to resupply Leningrad, which is under siege by the Germans. And without that facility, without being able to completely control the shoreline around Ladoga, they would not have been able to do that. Now, obviously, they shipped basically supplies across Ladoga when it wasn't frozen, and the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, those units that were stationed up around Leningrad to provide air support to the besieging forces under can't remember the name of the field marshal who was in command there, but essentially they attack these convoys that are coming across the lake. But the bottom line is that it's essential to keeping Leningrad going and keeping the front going, the Leningrad front, which is commanded by Zhukov. So that was the value of that incursion into that particular terrain that was owned by Finland. So despite the heavy loss of life, despite the massive casualties that the Soviets took, I mean, the Soviets invaded with well over 1 million men, and they lost well over 1/10, anywhere between 1/10 and 1/20 of their fighting strength was obliterated on the battlefield through ambush tactics, through basically, men freezing to death, equipment that wasn't working correctly, and the Finns just had the measure of them. They were better trained, they knew the terrain well, and they were fighting a type of warfare. They were a lot of them were they were infantry on skis, and they were just basically able to outflank, outmaneuver, and just cut the Soviets to pieces.
Okay, well, let's move on to 1940, and the date that I'm picking up here is this peculiar country. Well, it was when I was growing up. I never heard of Slovakia, so it's now the Republic of Slovakia. But back in 1940, it signed it joined the tripartite pact, so it came fully aligned with the Third Reich and Italy. Now, Slovakia at this point, 2.5 million people. It was semi-independent under the Austrian Empire. It was semi-independent under the Czechoslovak regime, but it had become independent once the Germans had invaded and taken over Bohemia and Moravia on the 14th of March. And you can see the red area, which was taken by Hungary during this period, lost some territory to Poland. And the person who everyone remembers from this is he became essentially the president, but he was Prime Minister, Tiso. He trained to be a priest. He kind of masqueraded as a Catholic priest. Slovakia, as you probably know, is a mainly Catholic country, mainly Catholic, whereas the western part, when you get to Bohemia, Moravia, you get more mixed and actually quite a large Protestant population. So that's a photograph of Tiso on the right, shaking hand with Hitler, signed the tripartite pact, and in the end sealed himself, of course, involved in terrible atrocities, the deportation of Polish Jews and the repression of the Slovakian Jews and the repression of its own people. And he was executed in Czechoslovakia in 1947. Anything to say on this subject, Joe, before we move on?
Catholic priest, Monsignor, and he was
he was a priest. Yes, you are right. Yeah,
and he was. It was kind of a strange one because, it's almost as soon as sort of Czechoslovakia is kind of portioned up, and basically a lot of territory is shaved off administratively, of course, and in terms of occupation, it is shaved off what originally used to be the territory of Czechia. And Slovakia is it loses territory as well, but it's partitioned off. So these two states, these two countries, which were one country at one point and then eventually became separate countries after the fall of communism in the early 1990s, were separated at this particular point. And the Slovaks, unlike the Czechs, and the Czechs were treated with a venom and with a with a level of bile by the Germans that it was pretty horrific. You had obviously a puppet regime in what is now the Czech Republic, controlled out of Prague, but effectively, it was a kind of like an apartheid system where basically the Germans were the ones with the rights and with the power, and they had the force of the regime behind them. And then the Czechs were basically the underlings, and they had their own little administration going on.
Well, the Czechia, it lost its national status. It was a Polish country. Slovakia retained its. This
is the point. This is the point I'm trying to make. It's like Czechia is treated more like a sort of a German colony. And, when Heydrich takes over at a later point in 1942, before his assassination, he is, when he's appointed to be the Reichsprotector of Bohemia and Moravia, he makes an announcement, upon there's this formal inauguration in Prague, where he's greeted by all these loyal German citizens, mainly Sudeten Germans, and he makes a long speech. He makes actually not a long speech, but a sort of a short but very detailed speech, where he lists out all the reforms that are going to be introduced under his authority, which basically involves Germanizing Czechia. But they're not going to do this to the Slovaks. The Slovaks will have a sort of a puppet regime. They'll have their own autonomy, and they're not been treated, even though really in terms of the Nazi view of the sort of the racial hierarchy, the Slovaks are not that much better than the Czechs. The Czechs are treated differently. They're treated like filth, and the Slovaks are kind of given a sort of a pass I think there's something that needs to be pointed out about the Czechs in particular. The level of contempt that Hitler had for the Czechs and a lot of Germans, particularly Austrians, was quite considerable. And they didn't seem to have this for the Slovaks. And some of this could be connected with the fact that the Czechs actually have a very close cultural and possibly ethnic relationship with the Russians, for whom we know the Nazis and the Germans held a considerable amount of racially motivated contempt. So it's a lot of this is racial, and it's to do with a cultural worldview and an outlook. And I think with Slovakia was, of the two countries, Slovakia was of both of them, Slovakia was the most overtly Catholic. And there is, and this goes back to basically the dealings with this puppet regime and with this Monsignor Tiso, it is actually possibly to appease the Catholic mind within Europe, particularly that part of Eastern Europe, and not to annoy the Vatican too much. So they've been selective, definitely, in terms of how they're dealing with certain communities, with certain nations, and with ethnic groups. And the Slovaks are among those countries that are, broadly speaking, favoured by the Germans in this regard.
Okay, well, let's move on to 1941 and the musical chairs in the Eighth Army. So on the left, you've got Alan Cunningham. He created the Eighth Army. So he was mandated to create the Eighth Army. Of course, we always like to point out this fact. Alan Cunningham is another Irishman. He's born in Dublin. But I think he was Royal Artillery. And then he was replaced by the person on the right, General Ritchie, who is wearing the tam o' shanter, who was originally Black Watch. Now, why did that happen? Why was Cunningham kicked out so peremptorily, and then Ritchie was brought in? What's going on there, Joe?
In a word, favoritism. Ritchie, it's not that Ritchie wasn't talented. I mean, I'd love to hear James Holland on this particular opinion. Or I think Cunningham was, as probably James Holland would regard, he's B-list. He's not A-list. He's a sort of a make-do commander. He's a good administrator. He's good organizer when it comes to basically, grouping together divisions and army corps and that level of organization. He's a good staff commander, and a very capable staff general, but he is not he's not considered to be a talented field commander by any measure, even though Cunningham oversees victory in the East Africa campaign. I mean, that is Cunningham's theatre. I mean, he runs that theatre, and he effectively runs rings around the Italians. It's a very successful campaign. It's a Commonwealth campaign. It involves British Army units. It involves Indian Army units. It involves African units. It's the first major involvement of the South African Army in a land conflict in the Second World War. And the South Africans perform brilliantly. And very interestingly, they serve alongside the men of the King's African Rifles, who were recruited from Uganda and Kenya, and primarily Muslim in that particular region of Africa. And the KAR units, there's so many of them recruited. This is known as the King's African Rifles as a regiment. It's technically a regimental formation, but there's so many battalions of the KAR recruited that they're able to form probably about 4 or 5 divisions, possibly even 6, throughout the course of the Second World War. It's the same in the First World War. And the King's African Rifles are considered to be an elite. They're sort of regarded in the same way that some of the more elite formations of the Indian Army, in terms of the colonial armies of the British Empire and the British and Commonwealth and Imperial forces, the KAR are up there. They're considered to be the best. And the South Africans, even though these soldiers, King's African Rifles, are black soldiers, officered entirely by white officers, this sort of class of colonial elite, this white elite that are based in Kampala and also in Nairobi, who, by the way, are not particularly nice most of the time to their soldiers. And the soldiers in years afterwards are pretty, from the KR veterans, are pretty frank about the fact that their white, mainly British officers, really treat them like shit. They don't pull their punches when it comes to their attitude towards the officer class within that all those regimental battalions. But when they serve alongside the South Africans, they bind together and they come together in a way that's absolutely amazing. And you have white South African soldiers, including those who would later be adherents of apartheid, who basically treat soldiers of the King's African Rifles like brothers in arms. Where this is important, this is where, coming back to Cunningham, how effective he was as a commander. The way in which he was able to bring together these various disparate units and formations of British imperial and colonial forces together and form them together into a cohesive land force, an army in the field, and use them to great effect to defeat the Italians in Ethiopia and in Eritrea and in Italian Somaliland, and basically back them into a corner. And effectively, in many places, they actually just basically besieged them. They cut them off, besieged them until they surrendered. That was Cunningham's achievement. And he actually proved himself very effective. But for the war in North Africa, in the desert, in Libya and Egypt, the Western Desert, Cunningham was not considered to be the most able commander. He was kind of past it in terms of years. Ritchie was a bit more younger. He was a bit more dynamic. Ritchie was directly connected with Auchinleck. He enjoyed patronage from people like Auchinleck and several other leading figures. Also, Churchill thought very highly of him.
Now let's move on to 1942. Now, in this week in 1942, Operation Torch, which of course had started the previous month, started at the start of the month. But at this point, the First Army was literally half an hour's drive from Tunis and pretty close to Bizerta, the two main objectives, the two great ports. So you see the map, Bizerta to the north, and then you see Tunis to the south. These were the objectives, deep water ports that could be used by the Allies in the invasion of Sicily, which had definitely was going to go ahead in May or June. And the First Army got basically, as you can see on the 28th of November, they got up to a place called Judeba, west of Tunis. And they then encountered the German army. So the Germans had mobilized very quickly. They had sent a force under General Nering, that's him there. He was number 2, I think, to Rommel. And he took command of the Stab Neren, which is the German, the Nering line. And he led to a major repulse. And eventually, by the end of the year, the Allies were pushed back, as you can see the red arrow, to a place called Medjez al-Bab. Pretty disastrous. So this was a bit of a pivotal moment. Up to this point, things were going swimmingly for the Allies, it appeared. The objective of securing the Bizerta and Tunis by the end of the year seemed to be well in hand. But then this week in November 1942, the Allies were blocked. So, Joe, we talked about Torch quite extensively. Anything further to add on this topic?
No, not a huge amount. I mean, the taking of Bizerta is considered to be a really important objective, and I think it's Omar Bradley who's in command. By the way, I'm still kind of I'm still sort of blushing with shame about my confusing of Ritchie and O'Connor. But Omar Bradley is ultimately responsible for the capture, and this happened sort of at a later point. I think it's in early 43, when they finally captured the port of Bizerta, because Bizerta holds out, and it's considered to be one of these key objectives in Tunisia, along with like Sfax and different other sort of port facilities. That will later be absolutely crucial for, sort of the embarkation of the expeditionary force that goes into Sicily. So they have
there's a very good World War II TV talk this week that was put out with Trevor Sheehan, who's the greatest living expert on the Tunisian campaign, with Ian Mitchell, who's done a book on part of the battle, and it's really interesting. It really summarizes the whole the whole scope of the Tunisian battle from particularly in the last month. So a very significant moment. So let's move on. Now, here we go. Oops. So here we have so one of the most consequential appointments of the war, would you say, Joe?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he changed the face of Germany, really, didn't he? I mean, him and Ira Aker and the command, Hap Arnold and Jimmy Doolittle, basically, and the guys who were commanding 8th Air Force, American 8th Air Force, out of England. I mean, together with Bomber Command, they basically, but particularly RAF Bomber Command, they absolutely gutted almost every single German city. I mean, it was like if you go to the Altstadts of German cities today, I mean, they've been miraculously reconstructed to a large degree. But like, I mean, at the end of the Second World War, something incredible like about 75 to 80% of all the urban areas in the whole of Germany. And bear in mind, Germany is a place where you can't go very far out of a city before you start going into another city. There probably isn't any more than 10 kilometers of countryside that you can go to in any part of Germany where there isn't a city or a very considerably large urban area. So this is a country that's filled with cities, and they're almost all basically leveled and obliterated, largely by RAF Bomber Command. And the reason I give Bomber Command the credit for this is very simple. You have the adoption of the bomber that has the largest bomb capacity of any bomber in the world, the Lancaster, happening just literally before Harris takes over Bomber Command. And basically the prototype Lancaster, which is essentially a Manchester with 2 additional engines, Avro engines, Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, basically added on by the Avro aviation company. Basically, they add 2 more on because the Manchester is massively underpowered. And when they create this new prototype, which is an adapted Manchester, basically called the Lancaster, and they test run it, they basically realize that they have something that's even better than the Halifax. And the Halifax at that point was coming online as their mainstay bomber, had a huge bomb capacity, but the Lancaster had a third more bomb capacity than the Halifax. So if you take both the Halifax and the Lancaster, which are manufactured in pretty large numbers, can't give you exact statistics about how many they produced, but you bring these online in massive numbers, and if you start bringing them to bear in large-scale bomber streams. I mean, when Dresden was bombed, it was bombed initially, the initial wave of the RAF, because it was bombed by day and by night. The initial wave of the RAF that bombed Dresden, it was about between 700 and 800 aircraft, primarily Lancasters and Halifaxes. And these are both bombers. The pair of them are basically the 2 largest bomb capacities of any bomber in the world. And they're able to cram in a huge amount of high explosive bombs, like heavy ordnance, the kind of stuff that basically rips the ground open, demolishes not just one neighborhood, but multiple neighborhoods with a single bomb hit. And then immediately after that, you got thousands of incendiaries falling out of one aircraft, basically into the ruins of those buildings and starting firestorms. This is what these aircraft are designed to do. And you have a commander who's coming online, taking control of Bomber Command, who is ruthlessly aggressive. His quotation, the quotation associated with Harris is, "We shall bomb Germany by day or by night, bringing to them with each attack a heavier drop of the misery that they've showered upon mankind." So what he's trying to do is he's trying to redirect basically it's essentially retribution for the blitz on the UK that took place between 40 and 42. But there's a practical objective. They are going to bomb Germany into the Stone Age until they stop. That is Harris's objective. And he says, again, another quotation, "There are those who say that bombing alone cannot win a war. My answer to them is, it has not been tried yet, and we shall see."
Yes. So November 1943, he said, we're going to beat the heart, we're going to bomb Berlin to obliteration. So a controversial figure to this day. Interesting personality. He joined the RAF in the First World War, like most of the senior commanders in the Second World War did. But he went off to Rhodesia.
That's right.
He considered himself Rhodesian even after the war. He wanted to be, he originally planned to be a farmer in Rhodesia, and he came back in the First World War. So an interesting character.
Absolutely. And just to say also, he lived for the last years of his life in the town of Goring in Oxfordshire. Interestingly, like the same spelling as Hermann Goring. It's spelled exactly the same way. Goring, a lovely little hamlet in South Oxfordshire. You should visit it sometime. They have a lovely church there.
The Goring Gap.
But it's kind of ironic that Harris, the head of Bomber Command, basically lives the rest of his life and dies in a little village called Goring. I think it's one of the great. Another thing, I just wanted to say that the reason Harris is also significant is because when he comes on as RAF Bomber Command's head, he does all these experimental attacks, including like he starts attacking Essen to basically dehouse Essen, because Essen is a major manufactory for the German war effort. So basically he pinpoints these particular industrial cities as targets, knock them out, basically, not through strategic hits on factories or what the Americans are doing, but just basically blast the whole place to smithereens. And the big experiment is the bombing of Hamburg, which is arguably worse than the bombing of Dresden. And that's a 10-day campaign. It's an ongoing campaign. And the slaughter that he inflicts is shocking by anybody's standards. And he's also bringing on board bomber streams that basically he's pushing the limits constantly. His big objective around 42, 43 is to have what he calls 1,000 bomber raids. We're talking about large scale, basically bombing campaigns involving 1,000 bombers or more, basically in terms of a coordinated saturation bombing campaign, the like of which has never been seen before. And he is orchestrating this on a scale that no Air Force commander has ever attempted, not in the American forces or the British forces. So he is really at the cutting edge of what the most horrific things that aviation can accomplish in terms of aerial warfare.
Okay, well, look, I'm going to continue with another date in 43, which we didn't actually put into the list because it's a little bit of a personal connection. Because on the 27th of November, the 8th Army had crossed the River Sangro and attacked the ridge in the distance. And this photograph was taken, I think, in 43. It's actually taken from very close where the Sangro, the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery, is, overlooking the Sangro. So you're looking north over the Sangro, and the ridge in the distance is the high ground. It's the eastern end of the Bernhardt Line. And so the 8th Army was still, at this point, Montgomery, as 8th Army commander, was still aiming to get up to Pescara and then cut across the peninsula using the main road to cut off Rome. So they were still hoping at this point that they would be able to take Rome by Christmas, although I think that hope was beginning to fade as the assault on the west coast by the 5th Army under Mark Clark was also fading. And the reason why this matters to me is because my dad was there. And this is the map of what happened on the 27th. The red arrow shows you where the 8th Indian Division attacked, and they did a night attack led by the Gurkhas, and they got repulsed at Montegrogno. It was one of the first examples of a flame-throwing tank being used against the 8th Army. And they were repulsed, and then the 1st Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers, London Regiment, they attacked and eventually took the town. It's one of their major battle honours. And then the following day, that's on the 28th, the Irish Brigade attacked up to the ridge successfully and advanced and broke the Bernhardt Line. Major battle honour for my father's formation. I've taken this photograph, and that's Montegrogno, which is on the it was on the western edge of the Bernhardt Ridge, of the ridge, the Vossakese Ridge, and you can see the photograph what it looked like in 1943, there's a flame-throwing tank had been knocked out. And the photograph on the right was what it looks like now, roughly exactly the same location. You can see the church on the left, same church. Anyway, the white is flattened. Right, we're moving on to Peleliu. We're talking about November 1944. So, as you can see on the map there, Peleliu is so small you can't really see it on that scale of map, but you've got New Guinea at the bottom. In previous episodes, we talked about the New Guinea campaign, and now Peleliu is part of the island hopping campaign, and you can see the tiny island, and the objective of this attack was the airfield. That was the objective of the Peleliu, and this was the 1st Marine Division. The reason why this campaign resonates so much, and this is a photograph taken of the south of the island during the landings, it's the subject of With the Old Breed by Eugene Sledge, who was a Marine. He was a Marine infantryman, a rifleman. And he wrote a book afterwards, With the Old Breed, which became the core of the television series The Pacific, which was very powerful. And his depiction in the book and in the depiction in the series is extremely, extremely moving and very, very savage fighting. Peleliu, I think it was said afterwards, I think Nimitz said he wished he hadn't done it. So what does the world say about the Battle for Peleliu now, Joseph?
Well, sadly, the conclusion a lot of people have come to who've studied the Battle of Peleliu, a lot of military historians, from what I understand, and it's sad to say. I can't really disagree with them looking at it objectively. There seemed to be almost no point to the taking of that island. I believe that the idea behind taking Peleliu was for, you had two conflicting forces going, in operation in the Pacific area. You had MacArthur and his army. And his army, it was multiple armies, but you had basically you'd Walter Kruger basically commanding the U.S. 8th Army, I think it was, and you had another army under Eichelberger. The number of the army escapes me momentarily, but you had effectively a something along the lines of an army group, what we call an army group, under MacArthur's direct command, plus a growing navy, basically not even a fleet, but a navy, to support MacArthur and to move his formations around. So our MacArthur becomes, by this particular point, almost independent of Nimitz. He's dependent on Nimitz and the U.S. Navy's resources, basically, and he's very much at the mercy of the Navy. He can't really move that much for the first year, but then more and more naval resources are diverted over to Australia and to basically all the effectively the army based areas in the South Pacific, and they become more mobile within the South Pacific, and they start to really plan operations to whip around Papua New Guinea and basically start making their preparations for an assault on the Philippines, which has to be authorized by the president. And the president has got, as we discussed before, he's got two conflicting proposals, one from Nimitz and one from MacArthur. Do we take the Philippines or do we go for Formosa, now known as Taiwan? And we had this discussion. They ultimately choose the Philippines. But as they're approaching the Philippines, because MacArthur is very careful, like MacArthur is big into bypassing Japanese strongholds. He's one of the first commanders in the Pacific who identifies quite correctly that you don't actually need to attack every single Japanese strong point, no matter what its strategic significance, because eventually, once you take enough strategic nodal points and basically prepare sufficient basis for attack, particularly if you've got a well-supplied fleet backing you up with battleships, with basically escort carriers, because they don't really need main sort of battle, battleship scale aircraft carriers. They don't need Essex class carriers, which is the primary class of aircraft carrier that they use for battle in the Pacific. They don't need stuff of that scale. They can make do with smaller scale escort carriers, which are cheaper to make and basically smaller in scale, and they do the job, and they provide the necessary air cover that is needed. They also have expanded. They've set up several different the air forces that are concentrated in the South Pacific are quite considerable. They've got bombers, they've got fighters, they've got all this land-based air power that they're able to call upon, as well as naval-based air power. Where there is concern is whether the Japanese can use, in addition to the Philippines, any surrounding islands, particularly anything off to the east and possibly to the west, that can basically threaten the flanks of an approaching armada with troops on board in considerable numbers. And he's very keen, because one of the things that needs to be remembered is 2/3 of the amphibious landings that take place in the Pacific are not done by the Marines. They're done, even though it's the Marine speciality, it is done by the Army. And it's a much forgotten point, and it's MacArthur that's doing it. He's overseeing these amphibious operations. So he's arguably a really, really talented commander in terms of the use of the combination of army and naval warfare in terms of amphibious warfare, basically what we now call combined arms. This form of combined arms is something, again, that has not been seen before on the scale that MacArthur has perfected it, and there's a lot of credit that should be due. Where MacArthur falls down, in my estimation, is his request that basically any surrounding satellite islands that possibly with airfields that might threaten his effort in the Philippines, and particularly his task forces that are basically landing his army and also keeping them supplied if there's any threat to them from any surrounding Japanese-held islands. That's what leads to the invasion of Peleliu. Nimitz accedes to his request and provides that support. But ultimately, the invasion of the Palau, basically chain of islands, and Peleliu in particular, is a massively wasteful campaign that bogs down the United States Marines for about, particularly the 1st Marine Division, for about a month and a half. And it's absolutely grueling. They take horrific casualties. It's massively traumatizing for the Marines that are on the island. The conditions that they meet from the moment they land right through to the campaign in the Umbingdols, which are basically the area of high ground, sort of rocky outcrops and high ground, sort of in the upper part of the island. Once you get past the airfield, this basically chain of rocky ridges and whatnot, where the Japanese have dug in caves, they've got entrenched fortifications, they're dug right into this. This is the kind of warfare, we were talking about Tara the previous week, this is the kind of warfare that is starting to test the United States Marine Corps, and it's testing their abilities. And in many respects, what happens on Peleliu, if there's any benefit from it at all, this kind of warfare that the Marines are encountering on Peleliu gives them a taste of what they might have to expect as they continue with their island hopping campaign, particularly when it comes to taking the island of Iwo Jima. In some ways, the 5th Marines that basically landed on Iwo Jima to take that island were actually quite well prepared because of the experience on Peleliu, because of the fact that they knew that the terrain on Iwo Jima was very barren, but there was a mountain and there was a lot of rocky outcrops. They understood immediately that the Japanese were going to be dug in deep into that island, and that they would need to employ tactics, and they would have to have specialized equipment to actually dig the Japanese out. They didn't have that when they went into Peleliu, and they needed to improvise. And Peleliu was just an absolute, very draining, wasteful experience from the Marines, but ultimately one that will prepare them for the tougher campaigns that are going to come, particularly in 1945.
Well, that's the last discussion point for this week. We had in 1945 the creation of Yugoslavia as a federated republic and the abolition of the monarchy. But we'll tell this because it resonates with the beginning, because at the World War II, National World War II Museum conference this week, one of the speakers, he was in fact the last speaker on one of the days, was Eugene Slade's son. So with The Old Breed that Eugene Slade wrote, that was published in 1981. So very early, quite an early memoir in the sequence. And certainly it came out more than a decade before Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers, which is now treated as being the seminal new approach to Second World War history, basing it on the accounts of people who served in Normandy and in France and in Germany. But Eugene Slade's book, which is the basis for the Pacific series, his son, Henry, has just published a new book, which is an updated, it's a full story of his father's The Old Breed. And it's infused by his son's account of what it was like to grow up with a man. He was very severely affected by his experiences, first of all, in Peleliu, which is nightmarish, and in Okinawa, and the way that he was struggling, because Ernest Slade came out of the army. He only became a teacher. He went to college, became a teacher, became a biology teacher, and he found great comfort. He couldn't concentrate. Eugene Slade's father said, "Let's go hunting." And Eugene Slade got there and he said, "I can't shoot anything anymore. I just can't do it. I can't." So his father, who was a very enlightened man, obviously, said, "Well, why don't you take up botany and start studying wildlife?" And he became a professor in that subject. And so Henry Sage, he's now, I think, about 60, this year has published his own book, and he was interviewed at the National World War II Museum live, and you can see it, in which he was giving new insights. And he said, there's a lot of information that wasn't published in The Old Breed. I put that in, I've got some more insights and a better understanding. And of course, for Henry, that's the son, his point of view was, in some respects, he was living out the trauma that his father was also acting out in the 40s, 50s, and 60s when he was growing up. So that's it. Joe, any final last word, Joe?
Yeah, Tehran, where Churchill and Roosevelt start to move in separate directions. And Roosevelt starts taking care of his own level of diplomacy, and there's no longer there's joined up thinking in terms of coalition warfare and how these campaigns are coordinated, but there's not joined up thinking in terms of the strategic footprint that the Anglo-American alliance is going to leave in the world after the war. As far as the Americans are concerned, Churchill and the British Empire are busted flush. They're bankrupt. Basically, any power they have is illusory. The Americans know that they're basically propping them up. They're supplying them with everything they need. The oil, the gas, the food supplies, the munitions, everything like that. They are propping this entity up, as well as fronting their own war effort, as well as giving everything to the Soviets. So there is more respect and accord shown by Roosevelt and the Americans towards the Soviets, beginning from Tehran, moving forwards until Yalta, from this particular point. And there's a particular breach in the relationship between, and the cracks in the relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill start to appear at this particular point. And Churchill starts to come away from all of this very disillusioned, and he's very worn down. And on his way back from having done the Cairo conference and having done Tehran, he goes back via Cairo and is returning via Tunisia and ends up landing in Tunisia, where he nearly dies. And this is a story that I will leave at a later point. We'll go into more detail about the Tehran conference. But as you are seeing in this photograph, you're seeing a very proud-looking Jozef Stalin. You're seeing a very cocky, arrogant, and proud Franklin Delano Roosevelt, looking off very proudly over towards Stalin's side. And there's a sort of a level of closeness there. And then you can see, even though Churchill is pivoted to one side, very much close, sort of almost kind of linking elbows with Roosevelt. Roosevelt is kind of looking away. And Churchill is sort of he is the aloof-looking one in this, and there's a comparable photograph at the Levadia Palace in Yalta where you can see a similar thing, where basically Roosevelt and Stalin seem to be more in sync and in step than Roosevelt and Churchill. Basically, Roosevelt is sandbagging Churchill and basically treating him as the awkward, the junior partner as opposed to the senior partner.
Analysing that picture, I mean, Churchill does look rather low. He was probably beginning to feel what was to be almost a fatal bout. He had a heart attack and he had pneumonia.
That's right.
In Tunisia, and then he spent months, at least 2 months, in North Africa.
Yeah.
And had in that position an influence on the Anzio campaign, the Anzio expedition. But I think that you could read into that picture the realization Churchill, the great imperialist, the man who believed in the British Empire as much as anybody did, who served in the British imperial forces, was a great advocate of the British Empire as a liberal enterprise. It's perhaps the photograph where the penny has dropped.
Yes, yeah. But I will say one thing.
His decision to get the Americans involved in the war, which was his only way of winning the war, has meant that in fact he's sacrificed the British Empire.
That's true. And he's also lost face in some respects. There is one thing that I would say though, before this conference opens up and before basically they start to sort of engage or lock horns on various different issues. There is the initial engagement between Stalin and Churchill at the British Embassy, and there is a formal ceremony where Stalin and Churchill, basically in the Soviet delegation and the British delegation, basically have a meeting, and they have their Soviet military aides and British military aides represented. Churchill also attends. There's newsreel footage available on YouTube where you can see this. Churchill basically meets all these Indian Army and British Army soldiers that have been put up for citations for involvement in campaigns in North Africa and different other places. And they're all been decorated in one big massive ceremony. And Churchill's meeting all these various different sergeants, particularly Indian Army, native Indian Army, basically Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims who have put their life and limb at risk and have fought very bravely, and they are receiving the military cross, and I think there's 1 or 2 Victoria Crosses that are actually pinned on a few lapels on behalf of the king. But later that particular day, Churchill and Stalin have a meeting, they preside over a formal ceremony within one of the main halls in the British Embassy. Main function rooms, a very square or kind of rectangular room with high ceilings. And in that room, and there's footage of it, a British soldier, basically in very proper fashion, steps up to Churchill holding something very long, basically held aloft in his palms. And he hands it to Churchill, who's standing directly before Stalin, surrounded by a crowd of Soviet diplomats and politicians and soldiers, members of the armed forces, as well as their British counterparts on the other side. And Churchill takes this implement and he hands it to Stalin, and Stalin bows down and he kisses it. And then he hands it to his Soviet aide, who's standing to one side, but he hands it the wrong way and it falls out. Now, the object that Churchill is presenting to Stalin is known as the Sword of Stalingrad. And it's basically a broadsword, a very long, it's about maybe 1.5 meters long, very long implement, which was forged in the Royal Armouries Forge in the north of England. And it's basically a purpose-made sort of broadsword, very long broadsword of the kind you would see Mel Gibson's William Wallace waving around in the battlefield at Stirling and also somewhere else. It's a very long sword, and Stalin accidentally, he handled it the wrong way. After he kissed it, let it fall out of the scabbard, and it damaged the handle. But if you go to the War Museum in the city of Volgograd, previously known as Stalingrad to this day, where you can see Vasily Zaitsev's rifle, among other, sort of detritus of war. You will see the sword of Stalingrad, which is given by the king on behalf of the people of the United Kingdom to the citizens of the city of Stalingrad in tribute to their magnificent victory. And this is a recognition, as we were talking about last week, about the significance of the Battle of Stalingrad to the overall outcome of the war. The British saw it as significant, and for this, the ceremonial sword was handed over by Churchill on the king's behalf to Joseph Stalin as a personal gift to the people of Stalingrad.
Very good. And just a comment on that picture, which I think you're quite right, Joe. It's one of the great iconic photographs. Tells so many things without words. Churchill looking depressed, marginalised a bit. Stalin looking cock-a-hoop, knowing that they've got the German army cooped up in Stalingrad. No, they were defeated at this point. They're on the run. And there's Roosevelt looking like the most important of all of them. But the curious thing in that photograph is that Roosevelt's he's got less than 18 months to live in that photograph. If you said who's going to die first, you'd say Churchill. In fact, Churchill was the last one to die. So Roosevelt dies in April 45, 18 months after his photograph. Stalin dies, I think, in March 53. And Winston Churchill, the rather ill-looking one on the right, he goes on for another 22 years until 1965. So don't lose heart if you're looking a little unwell in your own mirror, because it doesn't tell everything you need to know. Joe, thank you once again for a wonderful session. Lots of ground covered. And I'm going to say goodbye to you so I can say a few final words. Well, that's it. We looked at the period from the 23rd to the 30th of November, each year in the Second World War, some really vital moments. The Tehran conference, which we discussed, was one of those seminal moments in the history of the Second World War, and I'm glad we had a chance to discuss it. We're going to be back next week with another episode of This Week in the Second World War. So from everybody here, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.